Okay. All right, can we get everybody seated and we'll go ahead and start the next group. Can I have everyone seated, please? All right, where is Mark? There you are. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Applebaum. He's an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics, section of Hematology, Oncology, and Stem Cell Transplantation at the University of Chicago. He received his BA in Molecular and Cell Biology from the University of California, Berkeley in California. I said that. He received his MD at Northwestern University, Feinberg School of Medicine, and completed his residency at the University of California, San Francisco, and his fellowship back here at the University of Chicago. He is the author and co-author of numerous papers, articles, book chapters, and other works, and a member of various professional societies. I asked Dr. Applebaum to talk a little bit about the INRG database, what it is, what it's used for, and why it does exist. I thought it might be important just for families to know that there's, so much more going on behind the scenes that you may not know of, and I thought maybe a talk on the statistics and the databases and what these things are used for, that you get, again, a little bit better understanding of what's happening, all along the neuroblastoma research line. So CNCF was initial funder of the INRG database, I think when it first got started. So Dr. Mark Applebaum.
Thank you, Pat, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. And thank you to the organizers, of course. And so I have the privilege today, while I spend a lot of my time, I see patients, I also run a lab mostly focused on blood biomarkers and cell-free DNA. But I also spend a decent amount of time, I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Susan Cohn and Dr. Samuel Wolchenbaum, both as a member and as a user of the INRG Data Commons, is what it's now called. So, I was asked to give the perspective on how do we think about large databases, large data sets, and helping that move the field forward so that we can, obviously bring that back to the kids. So not to keep anybody in suspense, the INRG Data Commons, well, it's sort of a large database and a large Excel spreadsheet, but don't tell Dr. Wolchenbaum I said that. But to get to the real part of this, right? So no relevant disclosures. And so I don't think anybody in this room is going to disagree with the statement that we need more effective, less toxic treatments for these kids. And to do that, coming from the lab side of things and sort of the translational biology side of things, I myself and Dr. Cohn and many others in the field feel, and I think Dr. Federico touched on this nicely, we need to understand the drivers of neuroblastoma tumors, the microenvironment, the host variables, all the factors that influence a patient's response to treatment, as well as the toxicity that derives from it, and themes that have already been touched on this morning. So I want to take a little trip back in time, just to start with. So this is the front sheet of a biology protocol that, as you can see, was started in 1990, and this is actually a pediatric oncology group study that one of the precursors to COG. And this was a study, this was the very first one in neuroblastoma where there was an effort to start collecting data on patients. And many, the parents in the room, you've probably seen consent forms, hey, I'm sorry your children has neuroblastoma, but can you please sign this registry form so we can collect the data? It's always sort of an awkward ask as we're going through that question, but this is why it's important, and this is, I hope, to sort of impress upon you guys why we do that. So this was the very first version of that back in 1990, where it was really started as a way to collect information about things like MIC-N, some clinical characteristics, and really focus on the biology of what can we understand from patients when they're diagnosed. Dr. Cohn, as a young upstart back in, at the time, was then took over this study in the late 90s as a POG representative and said, well, we should link this all to patient outcomes. Right? Because how powerful would it be if we can actually say, here's the biology of the tumor, here's the characteristics of the patient, and now let's see how that correlates with how they did in the long run. And that set the precursor for the ANBL-OOB1 study. This is, something that, for patients who are enrolled on clinical trials, they always actually have to enroll on this study, even though it's not perhaps the focus of the family and treating the patient at the time that they're diagnosed. But Dr. Cohn and Dr. Maris actually set this up as once COG was formed in 2000 as a way to continue collecting the information for all the patients we're treating both on study, but also actually really importantly, collecting information on patients who are not being treated on study. And as I'll show you in a little bit, that's actually been a really powerful tool to learn more and more about this devastating disease. And so since 1990, we've actually, the Children's Oncology Group and its predecessors have been collecting all of this rich information, but ran into some problems, and we could do studies within North America, and we were able to say, let's look back at the data we've collected in the spreadsheets. But neuroblastoma is treated a little bit differently around the world. It's a rare disease, and if we're really going to learn everything we possibly can, we want to collect as many patients and put them in the same system so that we can understand not just hundreds of patients or thousands of patients, but tens of thousands of patients, and really collect what has become the most sort of robust and largest source of information on the widest range of patients with neuroblastoma. Looking back into the early 2000s, treatment, certainly still risk stratification was a thing. We were treating patients according to the risk group. However, it was actually really difficult to compare studies. So comparing studies, across the pond, as it were, between SciUp or SciUp-N and the Children's Oncology Group, comparing studies that were being done in Germany, comparing studies that were being done in Japan, was incredibly difficult, because the definition of who was treated on a high-risk trial just differed. And sort of how people were identifying patients was just different. And so if you're starting with different pools of patients, as Dr. Federico was talking about in terms of comparing apples and broccoli, right? You're sort of, that's the problem. And we're also at the time, the field was learning about different genetic features in clinical trials that were starting to be used towards therapeutic decision. And there's a lack of standardization across cooperative groups to really understand how do we learn more about how to treat patients optimally. And so you'll see a lot of group photos. One of the themes that we've already touched on is this is a team sport. And I think the INRG is actually an embodiment of that. So led by Dr. Cohn, as well as Dr. Andy Pearson in the UK, they basically wrangled all their friends together from both Children's Oncology Group, as well as SciUp-N, as well as the German group and the Japanese, and started the International Neuroblastoma Risk Group, or the INRG Task Force, in 2004. The initial meeting, as you can see here, is about 52 investigators. If you look closely, you'll see a lot of well-known people in the field. I won't go through all the names, but it's always kind of fun to see this group of people 20 years now and then see them at meetings like ANR now, or then versus now. But what happened was they were able to collect this pool of about 8,800 patients to start from these different, from POG registries that I showed you, from Children's Oncology Group registries, from the B1 study, as well as other study information that they had collected in these other cooperative groups. And so taking a step back, how did they get this information? Where does this information in the IRG come from? And what happens actually once you sign that consent form as a family and a parent? So as I mentioned, when a patient is diagnosed, doctors from around the country will go and say, will you sign this form to allow ARTS to put your child's information into a database? Well, that can happen from B1 as B1 gets phased out in terms of Project Every Child from Children's Oncology Group. We're starting to figure out how to enroll kids on that as well. And that information will be transmitted securely, in terms of things like when somebody was diagnosed, how old were they when they were diagnosed, what is their MIC-N status, what is, where is their disease, things like that will get transmitted to a COG database. And that patient will get a COG ID number so that the name and the identifying information will get disassociated from all the rich data that the researchers want to study. And that COG ID will be some sort of a number perhaps. And the beauty behind the INRG is they worked out with COG and other cooperative groups, how can we get data from all of these databases so that, one, we're not interfering with what COG is doing, but also that we can compare select patients, across institutions, across studies, track their biology samples over different places that they might go to get different sort of sequencing information, and do it in a way that's going to be unidentifiable to researchers so that we can distribute this freely without the risk of releasing patient information, right? Because we want to make sure that we are maintaining the privacy of all the patients and their families who are contributing to this database. And so there's a system now in place, and this is primarily done by Arlene Naranjo as the COG statistician. She has a key that will have all of the COG IDs for all the patients who have signed the B1 consent or other neuroblastoma consents, and they will get recoded into what's called a universal specimen identifier, or USI number. And this USI number, as you can see, they might go from something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to A, B, C, D, E. So it's a totally different code. It's a totally different nomenclature, and having worked with plenty of USI information, USI data, or USI coded data, I should say, I have no idea how to connect that to a COG number because Dr. Naranjo will never give that information out to anybody. And then, now that all the data has been recoded into USI, the select fields that have been agreed upon between the cooperative group and the INRG has been decided upon. Those specific data will then get transmitted to the INRG, specifically linked to the USI number and decoded from the COG identification number. And this is how the INRG was built and continues to be built to this day. And so from the initial INRG task force, a couple major sort of landmark papers came out in the field. One was, as was mentioned before by Dr. Desai, the criteria for what is an image-defined risk factor. So for those of you who are taking pictures about that, if you want to do some exciting reading, you can go back to this 2009 paper. It was also the development of the INSS that was also touched upon earlier, right? This is the first pre-surgical staging system where it mattered more about what is the biology and the features of the patient and not about, what is the sort of the level of your surgeon and their willingness to do a more aggressive operation. And so this was obviously a key for setting up all many of the staging systems and many of the risk grouping that has come since. And then secondly, we said, okay, Dr. Cohn said, okay, there's all this rich information on these 8,800 patients. What are the features that make someone higher risk or lower risk? Beyond just sort of saying what are the classification that we might use, are we actually going to be able to say, now that we've got all these patients from all these studies from across the world, what are really the true features of a high-risk neuroblastoma patient? What are the features of a low-risk neuroblastoma patient, and what might make someone intermediate risk? And from this came the INRG risk classification system, which is, as Dr. was mentioned, being integrated into COG studies moving forward. So, it really was this pretty vast international effort that's leading to these classifications moving forward. And this is the initial INRG database. So as I sort of gave away earlier, right, it was a giant spreadsheet. And this was kept by Wendy London, who, as Dr. Federico mentioned, he was one of the sort of master statisticians within COG. And this was coded out for 8,800 patients, and really this very rich data set of 20, 30 different fields of data. And what I think was a major advancement of this group, right, is said, okay, we've got this, let's keep using it. It was a unique resource for this disease that was really unavailable any other way. And I think Dr. Cohn and Dr. Pearson and the rest of the INRG task force really were quite insightful in saying, let's make this available to everyone. And that's essentially what has happened. And they set up a system wherein investigators, such as myself, a couple of the MDs in this room, could write an application to the INRG and say, here's the question I want to ask. I'm really interested in a big disease group, or in this case, I'm really interested in looking at a very rare, sort of clinical cohort that might be similar to one of the patients I just saw in clinic, all right? And I want to see, okay, I didn't really know much about this patient because there's not been a lot published about somebody with only nodal disease. Maybe I can go to the INRG database and find hundreds of kids with nodal disease only. And that's what this database facilitates. And so researchers can apply, and they say, here's my idea, here are the statistics I want to run, here's how I want to analyze the data so I can answer this question about rare or common groups within the database. And here's some examples of how that works in practice, right? So, going back to Dr. Bagatel's paper about localized disease and MIC amplification 2009, this ends at, one of our papers that we published looking at second cancers amongst neuroblastoma survivors. But there are many, many more of really sort of narrow cohorts of sometimes 60, sometimes a few hundred patients that we really could not understand anything about otherwise. Because even within Children's Oncology Group or with SciPen, with these small, rare cohorts, the more data you have, the more you're actually able to say. And so this is now the forward-facing website for the INRG. This is a public, open website. There's lots of things one can do here, so it's inrgdb.org. The picture's since been updated to a recent photo that was taken at ANR earlier this year, but the idea is still the same. And this website is a great resource for both scientists as well as parents and anyone interested in neuroblastoma. There we go. And before I get into the details of what's there and how we use that website and how we think about the database in its current form, I want to just point out that this is truly a collaborative effort. This is team science, right? So it's led by people like Dr. Cohn and Dr. Pearson, as well as Dr. Schleiermacher and Park. So there's representation from both COG, SciPen. You can see that the cooperative group chairs across the world, including Dr. Federico and others, are included as part of the leadership committee. And then there's various subgroups that are assigned with different missions, right? Things that are of interest to the field, such as genomics, understanding patterns of metastases, understanding more about what we can learn about relapse data. And so the various subcommittees will think about how we can sort of answer specific questions that we need to answer within the field using this sort of large data set. And so as of May 9th, there's about 25 to 26,000 patients within this database. I mentioned that it started as 8,800, but we are constantly adding, and this is very much a living database. And what I'll point out here is that our colleagues in Europe and Japan, they never had a biology study, so the only way the patients could get into their registries is actually through clinical trials. What I like to point out on the left here is we've got two different bars here, and with about 8,000 patients, 8,600 patients. The ones in the light blue, those are patients treated on clinical trials. Many of the ones you heard about earlier, who got who we know that kind of information. But we also have about half the patients from the Children's Oncology Group, which is good third or so of the data set is patients who were not treated on a clinical trial, and we're just signed that form to say we can be in a registry. But really adds a lot of data, a lot of power, a lot of information that wouldn't have been available without those biology studies I pointed out earlier. And as I mentioned, this is a living database. People are constantly adding new information. The INRG is very excited that they're now collaborating with St. Jude to include patients who are treated there and de-identify, sort of making sure that there's not overlap as patients can come and go between COG institutions and that institution. But just in the past year, the INRG has obtained information on probably about 3,000 or 4,000 new patients, as you can see. They get new COG data every 6 months for new patients that have been enrolled on the biology study, or now hopefully APEC, and then outcome data every couple of years. So this is a living thing. So we always make sure when we're doing an analysis that we're using the latest data because we know things will change. And if you go to that website, you can actually, so with a simple Google account, you can actually start to understand some of this data. So again, as of May, there are about 25,000 patients. And all the data elements that were used in the original INRG classification paper there, more data keeps getting added, and more types of data keep getting added. So information about race and ethnicity have been added. Information about what clinical trial a patient was on was actually just recently added in the past couple of years, which obviously allows us to understand perhaps what treatment the patient received. As more patients are treated with antibody or stem cell transplant or other therapies, right? It's really nice to have a sense of what was the therapy they got because we know that will inform their outcomes. There's also recently been information out about second cancers, which I mentioned before, as well as some imaging data, and I'll show you an example of how that's being used in a little bit. So if you're all, if you get tired of me speaking and you got your laptop out, any one of you could actually log into the INRG Data Commons right now. It's, as I mentioned, open to the public, and all you need is a Google account. Or there's a couple other ways to get in there, but Google tends to be the easiest. And anyone can register. It's free, it's pretty instantaneous, and you can log in and you can actually see exactly what data live in this data commons. And I'll tell you, it's not just neuroblastoma at this point, but mostly neuroblastoma at the moment. And once you log in, you can go to the Data Explorer and you can learn a little bit about who these patients are. So what I'm showing you here is just a screen capture of just the INRG patients. This was taken, a little bit, probably last year when we had, we'd say 24,000 patients. But you can see some basic demographic information in terms of male, female, race and ethnicity data can be displayed, as well as other data are possible to display. And then you can start, if you wanted to, doing cohort searches. And you can say, well, I really have a question. I want to know, how do patients with localized disease do? How many of them are there in this database? And are there enough to answer some question that I have? So in this basic example that I'm walking you through, you can, it's possible for researchers, for interested parties, to go in and say, I want to get all the neuroblastoma patients, and I want to know how many there are with INS stage 1, 2, or 3 disease. And you can save that cohort, and you can learn about, and you can know exactly how many there are. And then let's say you also want to say, well, I want to compare patients with localized disease to those who have metastatic disease, and how do they do? And you can make a cohort of patients who have had metastatic disease or INS stage 4 disease. And there's a tool built in where you can actually take that information and we'll say, well, I actually want to know how they did. What was their outcome of those particular patients that we're able to create this tool for? And so you can say, take the stage 4 patients and say, what is their survival by Kaplan-Meier analysis, and what are the localized patients, and what was their survival by Kaplan-Meier analysis? And the website at this point will actually generate this graph for you. You just say, here's the cohorts I'm interested in, and it will automatically plot these curves. It won't give you statistics. You can see sort of general numbers. The cooperative groups don't want people publishing these data, so you get a nice watermark back there. So a lot of thought has been put into here about data security, p-hacking, people using this for sort of just trying to find random associations that don't make any biologic sense. But like I said, it's a good, for researchers, this is a really nice hypothesis generating tool, and we can go in and say, okay, I'm really interested in this rare disease or rare subset of neuroblastoma. How many of those patients are there? Get a sense of what their outcome might be like, and get a sense of, is this something that as a researcher or as a scientist that I want to spend time on? And then it actually turns out that the INRG committee also really likes to see that somebody has done this and thought about it before they approve new projects. And the INRG is putting out, so I think, some very interesting projects, some very interesting data. These are some recent examples, but you can also go to that website, inrgdb.org, and you can see everything that the INRG has ever been published, or has ever published. There's a link to that. There's also a link to projects that are ongoing and in process, and you can see the proposals that people are working on, and you can see sort of where it's been presented and what the data are. But it's been a very productive consortium, and we're still learning new things. And these are just a couple of papers that were recently published this year. One from Dr. Campbell and Du Bois looking at INRG stage as a predictor within the database, as well as work led by Dr. Desai looking at race and ethnicity outcomes of patients within the database, following up on work that was done by Dr. Henderson about a decade ago. There's also been several abstracts that have been presented at recent meetings. And the one on the bottom I actually want to point out is a very interesting example of ways the database is actually expanding. So one of I'll call it the limitations of this database is that the Children's Oncology Group and the cooperative groups don't collect specific treatment data. Because of the way the studies are designed, they're designed as an intent to treat, or what arm was this person assigned to, regardless of what they actually got. The Children's Oncology Group doesn't have the resources, or hasn't prioritized, and Dr. Federico can correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't always have that information of exactly what somebody got. And so one of the things that Dr. Cohen and Dr. Wolchenbaum and others at the University of Chicago have been doing is actually trying to link the INRG patients from our institution to the EHR, the electronic health records. And they're working on actually extracting that treatment information for those patients and linking them to their INRG numbers through the USI. This is obviously a big project because it has to actually go through COG because we need that key, and COG holds the key. So this is a project that they've been working on. They actually showed that this was possible in proof of concept. And there are efforts that are working now to expand this to other institutions so that we can start getting that rich treatment information to know exactly how much antibody did somebody get, how much topotecan did somebody get, to really link outcomes with hopefully side effect data as well as outcome data. And as I mentioned, there's been a lot of projects published, underway, and recently approved. Many international collaborations are fostered by this. In fact, it's strongly encouraged by the executive committee that there be representatives of multiple cooperative groups on every project so that we are all working as a big team. The other really important facet, I think, of the INRG data commons, is training the next generation of researchers. And I was recently told that I'm no longer allowed to call myself a young investigator. So now I'm looking at how do we build the next generation. I got my start actually in database work and research. So when I was in San Francisco, I met Steve Du Bois, and he actually gave me a database project to work on as my very first research project. I had no interest in research prior to that. But actually, through working with him and through that project, discovered, this is actually something that I enjoy and really changed the trajectory, such that now that I spend, most of my time thinking about how we can improve, neuroblastoma outcomes through basic science research. So database projects and projects like, things that can be accomplished with the INRG actually become a really good tool to both interest and educate the next generation of doctors and scientists about about research and research methodology. And realizing this, the INRG has significant efforts in trying to increase the number of new investigators who are looking into neuroblastoma, increase the number of young investigators who are involved in projects at really any level, whether that's driving projects forward or just sort of being involved in the team to really understand how the process works. And because this is an international consortium, right, we're able to pull in mentors and senior faculty from around the world who have expertise on whatever the topic at hand may be, to work with those young investigators to really move the field forward, move the scientists forward, and find new ideas and innovative ideas that might not come from sort of the standard people who think about this and are running the database. Another sort of exciting feature that's coming down the line is that this database, while primarily clinical data, is being linked to other sources of genomic data, as well as sequencing data and other kinds of information that are not currently held within the INRG. The INRG has very much been focused, as I mentioned, on what is the biology of the tumor, what is the patient's, what is the patient's age, clinical characteristics, and tumor characteristics. But because of that USI number, right, when COG has, or any other group has released biospecimens to researchers who do sequencing and then put that sequencing online and make that available to public, it's always tagged with that same USI number. So it's fairly straightforward to link patients from the INRG to another data commons of sequencing data or other information through that USI number. And now the INRG actually has a direct link where if if a researcher or anybody here had a cohort they're really interested in, and they wanted to know, is there sequencing data? There's a quick search tool, and actually it's able, people are able to download the list of what patients have that data, go to that database and say, here are the patients I want, show me the data. And then they can grab that data from that other sort of genomic data commons. So really facilitating the link between patient information and broader genomic information as well. I'll highlight one other study that I think was pretty cool, but I'm biased. So this was a study where the first study where INRG had worked to get imaging data linked to the INRG data, primarily spearheaded by Dr. Volcherbaum in getting the data available. But patients who were enrolled on one of the COG protocols, 12P1, there were about 100-something patients who had MIBG scans that were collected centrally by the Children's Oncology Group. And Dr. Volchenbaum worked with the NIH to de-identify those scans and link those to the database through that USI number. And thus, now we had a few hundred MIBG scans, some CT scans, linked to the INRG so that people who are interested in using those data could do it through COG, but could also do it through other mechanisms once more data is added, right? This allows for the opportunity to link MIBG scans in the US with MIBG scans in Europe, for example. This is a very early sort of pilot project based on that, but effectively what we did was we took those MIBG scans and we tried to say, using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, could we actually try to predict who was going to respond to therapy? And the short version was kinda. So this, there's always a data problem when you're talking about AI in pediatric oncology. But this is, what I'm showing you here is effectively a heat map, or sort of an image of what is the machine learning or the AI looking at when it says, where is neuroblastoma in the body? And all those sort of red spots, the greener spots, were where the algorithm was looking at the MIBG scan to make a prediction of, was this patient going to respond to their therapy or not? I won't get into the details. The sort of utility of this was modest, but I think as a proof of concept, it's a very interesting idea. And as I mentioned, the INRG is constantly evolving and constantly changing. And new data elements are coming, and so that we'll be able to learn new and exciting sort of information that we can use towards thinking about the next clinical trials. So as was mentioned, ALK, obviously very important in understanding neuroblastoma biology and potentially therapy. There's committees, the genomics committee has been working very, very hard to get that data from the cooperative groups so that ALK aberrations, whether they be mutations, translocations, be sort of clearly and readily identifiable within the database. The other variable that obviously has been touched on a couple of times already, but is not currently available, is response data. I learned from Dr. Cohen very early on, if a patient responds to treatment, they're going to do better. That's sort of a mantra we have at University of Chicago, although it's kind of obviously a little bit obvious, hopefully. But anyway, right, response data is super critical to understanding the patients, their outcomes, and give us an idea of what treatments are working and what are not working. And those response criteria, whether they be INRC from 2017 or the Bordeaux criteria or others, are also being collected and hopefully will be making their way to the database soon. So with that, I'll pause. Happy to take questions. These are sponsors of the INRG database, or Data Commons. As Pat mentioned, CNCF was an early contributor to get this up and running. So thank you all for your attention.
Does anyone have any questions? All the math majors in the room.
I'm Allie Springsteen from Illinois. Mine's kind of a general question, maybe not necessarily to you specifically, but as a parent, how do we go about getting our doctors? Like, we don't have a doctor who specializes in neuroblastoma or knows much about it, so they don't do urine tests except for at diagnosis. They don't know about the HA test. They didn't realize you could have neuroblastoma without bone pain. Just little things that they don't know. So as a parent, how do we go about changing that at our hospital? Or who would we I don't know, discuss
Yeah, no,
it?
that's a great question, and I'm sure many of my colleagues would have their additional thoughts on that. I think dissemination of information and asking good questions is always important. It is, in my experience and the experience of many of my clinical colleagues, right, we're always asking each other questions. People are constantly reaching out, doctors from other institutions who know more or know less, and saying, what should I be thinking about? How should I be thinking about this patient? What test should I be ordering in some cases? And is this the right approach? Our team gets many of those emails, calls, frequently. I'm sure that is happening across the country at some of the major neuroblastoma institutions, right? The clinicians are getting many, many calls from both parents and doctors saying, does this make sense? So from one level, I think that's sort of the organic way for it to happen. Other ways that are happening, right? There's guideline papers that are put out by the Children's Oncology Group that are being worked on by the INRG. I'm actually part of a group that's working on what are the biomarkers that we should be using now and what are the biomarkers that we should be using later. Those papers take time and are few and far between, but those are always, I think, good resources for clinicians who are less familiar with the disease to say, what should I be testing? What should I be thinking about? How should I be doing this? And it's not just for biomarkers, right? It's also for, how do I treat, upfront neuroblastoma, and when should I be getting scans? So, or other kinds of urine tests. So I think those are the two ways, sort of from the bottom and from the top, that I think it tends to happen.
Any other questions?
Question. Meg, I didn't introduce myself last time. Megan from Los Angeles. Thank you, Dr. Applebaum, for a great and really informative presentation. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned the decision to recently add race and ethnicity as a marker that can potentially, help us look at outcomes. So were there any indications that would lead you all to add that now? I think it's great, but was there any data to suggest that that informs outcome?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, and obviously a critical question that we should be asking, given the disparities that we know exist within our healthcare system. This was actually started by, I think, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Henderson, two of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, who published an initial analysis of this, back in about 2010, I think, was when this was actually published originally. And there was an identification that patients, black patients, had poor outcomes with high-risk disease. And one of the things that the INRG is very conscientious of, and it's actually, I think, quite interesting that Children's Oncology Group collects that information. In Europe, there are no race or ethnicity data that are collected. So this was sort of an INRG study of COG patients. And we wanted to ask, how have the disparities changed over time? Dr. Desai can speak more to this as she was sort of the senior author on this, but I think it was really important for the INRG and for researchers thinking about this to say, how can we think about all of our patients, and all of the groups that we should be thinking about to make sure that everyone is getting the optimal care?
Mind if I add something?
Please.
Okay.
So
Ami
in the
Desai?
original report that Dr. Applebaum is alluding to, we saw that there was a higher incidence of high-risk disease among Blacks and Native Americans, but that treatment actually mitigated the differences so that all high-risk patients, despite race and ethnicity, were doing about the same in that original report. I think in the updated report, when we're looking at a newer cohort that just recently was published, that we're seeing some of those still similar incidents and disparities. And in current era therapy, we're sort of seeing some differences in how in outcomes among the high-risk patients based on race and ethnicity that requires additional investigation. So it's a little bit hypothesis generating and will need to be investigated further. But I'll say beyond that, there are a lot of investigators through the Children's Oncology Group, really work spearheaded by Kira Bona and others that are also looking at, the impact of social determinants of health and things such as poverty and being able to get to your appointments or have healthy groceries or have a good diet and all those things and how that may also. So beyond just treatment, people are looking at other social determinants of health and how can we really optimize the outcomes for all of our patients through, all around.
Okay. One more question?
Can you see down the road that possible microbiome data be involved?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think microbiome data are certainly starting to be collected by various groups for patients with neuroblastoma. I think it would be interesting to include any data, right? I think more data, as somebody who likes to study large data sets, more data, always better data. And so, where does the microbiome data go, though, is the question, right? So I would see it probably more as a linkage kind of thing, but yes.
What institutions are gathering that data right now?
Yeah, so I would,
of
the two that I know of, and I'm not going to say this is any way conclusive. I know some of this work is being done at Sloan Kettering. I know we have a project at the University of Chicago working on this.
I'm sorry.
University of Chicago.
Okay.
Comer. I know Dr. Desai is actually also leading that project as well. So, you know, and I'm sure there are other sites that I'm just not as aware of, but I know there are people looking at that specifically for children with neuroblastoma.
Thank you, Doctor.
Of course.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Applebaum.
Thank you.